When night falls and sound withdraws, the archive remains. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. Late light does not move across the ground as a body would. What changes is incidence, the angle at which illumination meets plane. A source far beyond the scene descends gradually, and the descent alters distribution before it alters outline. A wall that earlier received brightness as an even field now carries a gradient. Upper regions dim first, not because the wall withdraws, but because the direction of arrival shifts. Lower regions retain illumination a little longer, and the boundary between these regions is not a line, but a slow change in density. A vertical object stands. Its height is constant. Its mass remains where gravity keeps it. The object does not lean, yet beside it a darker region appears, and the region lengthens as the source lowers. Nothing tangible travels across surface. No contact occurs. The change is a remapping. Obstruction translated onto plane. Light advances in straight paths. An object interrupts those paths. The absence left behind takes the shape of that interruption. Projection increases as angle decreases. The ground does not resist this increase. There is no friction because nothing rubs. There is no sound because no surface is displaced. A shadow is not an entity that pushes its way forward. It is a changing arrangement of lit and unlit regions, recalculated continuously as geometry rotates. Texture modifies legibility. On rough stone, micro elevations and pits break the boundary into small irregularities, a tremor at the edge where illumination is already thin and easily scattered. On smoother concrete, the boundary sharpens because the plane offers fewer micro variations to disperse light. The difference belongs to the surface, not to the darkness. Darkness remains the same subtraction. The plane determines how that subtraction is drawn. A slight shift in terrain changes reach. Where the ground slopes downward away from the source, extension accelerates. Where the ground rises toward the source, compression occurs. Incline converts height into distance differently than a level plane does. A small object placed on higher ground can cast farther than a taller object set below, because plane completes the relation. Height alone does not determine length. Height and angle negotiate through the plane that receives them. Two objects of identical height stand at different distances from the source. The nearer one casts a shorter projection. The farther one casts longer. Distance from source alters angle of incidence even when height remains constant. The same object moved across the plane would cast a different length at each position, not because the object changed, but because angle is a relation between source, object, and plane, not a property that any one of them carries alone. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between the two, nothing needs to be grasped. Angle continues to lower. A corner is reached. The projected boundary bends without crease. It conforms instantly to the new direction of surface. The bend is not effort, it is alignment. When a step interrupts the plane, the projection divides. Part remains on the upper surface. Part appears on the vertical face. The shadow does not fall as an object would. It simply occupies whichever surfaces lie in the region deprived of direct illumination. A door frame divides it. Gravel fractures it into fragments. Each fragment is not a broken piece, but a local solution to the same geometry applied to a different microplane. Where gravel fractures the projection, Each stone receives its own small solution. The top face of a raised pebble is lit. Its far side is not. A tiny dark region forms behind it, too small to read as shadow from any distance, but present as the same phenomenon at a smaller scale. The projection across the gravel is therefore not one shadow but many, all governed by the same source, all obeying the same geometry, each resolved by its own local surface. The scene contains the same relation at every scale simultaneously. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. The scene does not announce that it is changing. It changes by continuous recalculation. A line extends. A boundary softens. A region deepens, not through added substance but through reduced light. The object remains unchanged. The plane remains where it is. The source continues its descent beyond reach of any hand. The rate of change is not constant. Early in the descent, when the source is still relatively high, extension increases slowly. A degree of descent produces a modest lengthening. Later, near horizontal, the same degree of descent produces a far greater extension. The geometry accelerates without the source accelerating. Late evening produces more visible change per unit of time than mid-afternoon, even though the source moves at the same rate throughout. What changes is the sensitivity of the relation to the angle, a sensitivity that increases as the angle decreases until near horizontal, where small changes in source position produce large changes in projection length. A narrow post produces a slender projection, like a blade laid flat upon the ground. A broad wall produces a field. Width alters breadth. Angle determines length. Two objects standing apart cast separate regions that begin to intersect as extension increases. Their overlap deepens where illumination is most reduced. Darkness crossing darkness does not cancel. There is no inverse operation here. Overlap is simply the intersection of regions already deprived of direct light, and the intersection appears denser because the surrounding field remains slightly brighter by comparison. Branches overhead introduce a secondary pattern. Leaves filter light into intervals, creating a flicker that moves across the steady extension. Two movements now exist on the same plane. One steady, governed by the descent of the source. One irregular, governed by air-moving foliage. The steady movement elongates without pause. The irregular movement trembles, appears, vanishes, appears again. The ground receives both, not as narrative but as superimposed relations. Where leaf shadow crosses the longer projection, the two do not merge. They occupy the same plane, but they arrive from different scales of obstruction. The leaf shadow is small, soft-edged, transient. The projection beneath it is longer, steadier, more defined near its source. Both exist simultaneously on the same ground, without interfering with each other's geometry. The plane holds multiple relations at once, each resolved separately, each indifferent to the others. Edge behavior changes with distance. Near the object, where contrast is strongest, boundary appears more defined. Farther away, the edge softens because light arriving at low angle is already thin, already dispersed by atmosphere and surface microtexture. A long projection becomes less certain at its extremity, not because it retracts, but because distinction becomes harder to resolve. The end of the shadow does not terminate sharply. It dissolves into the surrounding dimness where lit and unlit approach similar values. The plane participates. Rough gravel interrupts continuity by offering many small angles, each scattering light differently. A shadow across gravel becomes a collection of micro-shadows and micro-reflections. On a smoother slab, continuity returns, and the projection reads as a more unified region. The phenomenon remains the same subtraction. The plane's microgeometry alters how subtraction is registered. Multiple sources introduce duplication. A faint secondary edge appears offset from the primary boundary. Two outlines travel together, separated by small angular difference between sources. The secondary outline is weaker, less stable. As one source fades, cloud, a lamp behind a window, a reflection from glass. The duplication diminishes. The primary edge remains as long as the dominant source remains. Dependence becomes visible without explanation. Projection is not inherent, not owned by the object, not stored in the plane. It exists only in the relation among source, obstruction, and receiving surface. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the scene continues its quiet arithmetic. As evening progresses, air cools. Surfaces release stored warmth. Cooling changes reflectivity subtly, not by intention but by physics. Moisture may begin to condense invisibly. Roughness may hold thin films that scatter light differently. The plane becomes less reflective. The difference between illuminated and unilluminated regions decreases, and the projection's boundary softens accordingly. The shadow has not changed its nature. The medium has changed the visibility of the relation. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. A shadow does not claim territory. It occupies area that illumination cannot reach directly. The occupation is temporary, contingent, and silent. Remove the object, and the area becomes lit. Remove the source, and the distinction disappears. Remove the receiving surface, and there is nowhere for projection to be mapped. The archive, if it keeps anything here, keeps the dependency rather than the object. A wall, some distance behind the primary object, receives the projection's terminus, or would, if the wall were close enough. Without a wall, the projection continues across ground until contrast fails. With a wall, it climbs the vertical surface and terminates there, the upper boundary rising as the angle lowers. The wall does not stop the projection. It redirects the mapping onto a new plane. The geometry continues uninterrupted. Only the surface that receives it has changed. The angle approaches near horizontal. Extension now increases disproportionately relative to object height. A modest rod produces a length many times its dimension. Geometry amplifies quietly. No mechanism is visible. No hinge turns. Yet proportion expands because tangent increases as angle decreases. The increase is not dramatic. It is continuous, like a tide that cannot be heard, yet alters the shoreline. Uneven terrain makes the relation visible. Where the ground dips, the projection accelerates across the descending plane, reaching farther than on level ground. Where the terrain rises, compression occurs. The shadow shortens in visible extent not because the object changes, but because the receiving plane tilts into the path of light. Incline reveals itself through distortion. The line measures terrain without measuring it, indicating slope through its own stretching and compressing. A shallow depression in the ground causes the projection to accelerate across it and then slow again as the terrain levels. The change in rate is not visible as a seam. It appears as a slight elongation across the low point, a subtle widening that a careful eye might register as the ground being lower there, even without any other cue. The projection maps the terrain's depth without touching it, without pressure, without contact of any kind. It is a reading taken by geometry alone. At the edge of a step, part of the projection vanishes from the upper plane and appears on the vertical face. The boundary becomes segmented: horizontal region, vertical region, then horizontal again. The transition is instantaneous because the geometry is continuous. The surfaces change, the mapping changes. The shadow does not climb the riser by will. It occupies the riser because that is where the region deprived of direct illumination falls. A railing casts a lattice. The pattern extends and compresses as angle lowers. The spaces between rails become elongated gaps of light, and the rails become elongated bands of darkness. The pattern is not decoration. It is the relation between repeated obstruction and repeated interval. Repeat a shape and the projection repeats. Change the angle and the repetition stretches. The plane becomes a page on which angle writes without ink. Between the elongated bands of the railing's projection, the lit intervals are not uniform in brightness. The angle of arrival means that the near edge of each lit interval receives light more directly than the far edge. A slight gradient exists within each gap, brighter on one side, marginally less so on the other. The eye does not isolate this difference easily, but it is present as a consistent structure across the entire lattice. The railing is one object. Its projection contains many small gradients, each one a local record of the source's position. The far edge loses clarity further. At low angles, light arrives through more atmosphere, more scattering, more diffusion. The boundary becomes increasingly uncertain because contrast thins. Eventually, the far extent becomes indistinguishable from the surrounding dim field. The shadow does not retract. It dissolves into a value range where shadow and evening cannot be separated by the eye. Multiple sources, if present, may briefly create triple edges: a dominant outline, a faint companion, a ghost line that appears only at certain angles. As one source weakens, cloud thickening, interior light switching off, reflection shifting, the extra edges vanish. The dominant outline continues until the dominant source lowers beyond effective projection. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between the two, the last visible boundary thins. At a certain point, extension reaches a practical maximum, not because the geometry stops, but because the receiving surface can no longer register difference. The relation continues in principle, but visibility fails. The shadow becomes coextensive with the dim field. The phenomenon does not end as an event. It becomes inactive as contrast. Night stabilizes the surfaces. Without sufficient contrast, projection ceases to be readable. No line advances, no proportion shifts. The object remains upright. The plane remains receptive. The source exists beyond the horizon, still present as a condition even when not visible. The relation persists as capacity rather than display. Earlier, the plane carried a measurable extension, without friction, without sound, without intention. It revealed incline, intersected with other projections, duplicated briefly under multiple sources, and softened at distance where contrast thinned. Now the field appears uniform, not as emptiness, but as a steady condition in which differentiation has fallen below threshold. Potential does not require activation. It sits in the structure of the scene, a surface capable of receiving, a source capable of emitting, an obstruction capable of interrupting, and an angle capable of changing. Remove any one element and projection cannot occur. Keep them all, and projection can return without being stored anywhere. Nothing needs to be preserved as object. The relation reforms when conditions realign. Dawn will restore the relation, not by returning the shadow that was present at this hour yesterday. That exact configuration existed only once, at that angle, with that moisture on the surface, with those leaves in that arrangement overhead. Tomorrow's dawn will produce a different configuration, equally contingent, equally temporary. The relation does not repeat, it reforms. Each instance is the first and only instance of those exact conditions meeting on that plane. The object that casts the projection stands in the same position it held at noon. Nothing about it has changed. Its height is the same. Its mass is the same. Its surface holds whatever texture it held in morning light. The only difference between the object at noon and the object now is the condition surrounding it. The object did not participate in the change. The change occurred around it, through the slow rotation of relations, source, angle, plane, that it could not influence and did not need to. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the same suspension holds, readiness without demand. The object's reach is now zero, not because it has shrunk, but because illumination is absent. The plane no longer hosts a boundary, because the difference between lit and unlit is not available. The archive does not preserve a shadow as a thing. It preserves the dependency that makes a shadow possible. Angle, surface, source. The plane that held the projection for the entire duration of the descent holds it no longer. It is the same plane, the same surface texture, the same slope, the same stones half embedded at their particular depths. Nothing about the plane has changed that would prevent the projection from returning. The plane is as ready now as it was at noon. It holds that readiness in complete stillness, without effort, without anticipation. Readiness that requires no maintenance is not a condition the plane achieves. It is a condition the plane simply has, by being what it is, in a scene where the other elements of the relation exist and may return. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. Breath enters, breath leaves. No extension remains to follow. No edge remains to resolve. The plane rests in uniform dark. The angle waits beyond view. The relation rests. The relation rests. No contrast remains. No projection advances. The plane holds its quiet. When night falls and sound withdraws, the archive remains. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. Air occupies every interval before it is noticed. It sits between wall and table, between ceiling and floor, between the edge of one object and the edge of another, filling the room without giving the room any additional shape. In the afternoon, it tends to vanish from attention because it offers little resistance. Light crosses it with minimal scattering. Sound crosses it with a loss that feels ordinary. Distance seems transparent because the medium behaves consistently. On certain evenings, the transparency changes while the geometry remains fixed. A room is still a room. The width from one wall to the opposite wall does not shorten. The corridor still contains the same number of steps from door to door, yet the interval between points behaves differently, not as mood, not as metaphor, but as a measurable shift in transmission. The same events occur, and what arrives is less articulated. The path has changed, while the length of the path has not. A door closes somewhere nearby. At the hinge, the contact is clean, and the initial transient contains sharpness, high-frequency energy that defines the edge of the event. Across the room, the arrival is softened. The volume may not be dramatically lower, yet the contour is rounded. The first instant has lost its crisp boundary before it reaches the ear. The medium has altered the crossing. Sound moves through air as alternating compression and rarefaction. Molecules collide, transferring energy forward. In lighter conditions, those collisions disperse energy in a pattern that preserves detail across moderate distance. Sibilants remain recognizable. Small impacts retain their bite. Reflections return as faint tails that extend the event beyond its origin. When the air becomes denser through cooling, increased humidity, reduced convection, the number and character of interactions per unit distance change. The medium's mass per unit volume increases. Inertia within the medium increases. Certain frequencies lose coherence sooner. The decay curve steepens without the source changing at all. Breath enters, breath leaves. The lungs draw in the same medium that shapes the room's reach. A spoon touches ceramic. At the point of contact, the vibration is precise. Across the room, the arrival contains less definition. The body of the sound remains, but the outline has blurred. Something has been absorbed in transit. The object did not soften. The hand did not change. Only the interval intervened, taking away part of what would normally survive. Between the spoon and the ear, nothing visible occupies the distance, and yet the distance is occupied. What the air removes in transit, it removes without remainder. Not stored, not redirected, simply no longer present in what arrives. Loss without trace, absence without record. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between the two, nothing needs to be grasped. Angle continues to lower. A corner is reached. The projected boundary bends without crease. It conforms instantly to the new direction of surface. The bend is not effort, it is alignment. When a step interrupts the plane, the projection divides. Part remains on the upper surface. Part appears on the vertical face. The shadow does not fall as an object would. It simply occupies whichever surfaces lie in the region deprived of direct illumination. A door frame divides it. Gravel fractures it into fragments. Each fragment is not a broken piece, but a local solution to the same geometry applied to a different microplane. Where gravel fractures the projection, each stone receives its own small solution. The top face of a raised pebble is lit. Its far side is not. A tiny dark region forms behind it, too small to read as shadow from any distance, but present as the same phenomenon at a smaller scale. The projection across the gravel is therefore not one shadow but many, all governed by the same source, all obeying the same geometry, each resolved by its own local surface. The scene contains the same relation at every scale simultaneously. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. The archive, if it notices anything, does not privilege the source. It privileges what lies between, not the event itself, but the transformation that occurs as the event moves through the medium. In this kind of evening air, distance still exists as measurement, but it exists less as carrier of information. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. When air is light, it makes space feel open because it allows extension. Sound strikes a wall and returns faintly. That return is not an echo that demands attention. It is a small additional line that lengthens the original event, giving it width in time and width in space. When air gains density, less energy survives that round trip. The return weakens, the tail shortens. Events conclude closer to where they began. The room does not shrink, yet it feels less broadcast because transmission is less generous. 2 points across the room remain 2 points. The interval between them becomes less transparent, not because something visible fills it, but because the medium asserts itself through loss. A candle, if there were one, would illuminate less of the wall behind it tonight than it would on a dry winter evening. Same flame, same wall, different medium. The candle does not know this. The wall does not know this. Only the air between them holds the difference, and it holds it without display, without record, the way all conditions hold themselves, by simply being what they are until they are something else. A footstep occurs in an adjacent corridor. The floor receives the same force. The body's mass does not change, yet the footstep arrives with reduced texture. The heel's brief sharpness is diminished first. The remaining sound is present, but it is less edged, and the event ends sooner because the air does not return as much of it from the surfaces. A clock continues. The mechanism is unchanged. Each tick is produced with the same impulse, yet each tick occupies less perceived space. The tail that would normally extend into the silence between ticks is shorter. Time has not accelerated. The air has reduced the lingering. What persists between ticks is not silence in the usual sense. It is the medium continuing to hold what little remains of the last event, while the next event has not yet arrived. A thin suspension. Not emptiness, not presence. The interval itself, made audible as texture by the air's density. Humidity gathers as the temperature drops. Cooler air settles nearer the floor. Warmer air remains above. Layers form, sometimes subtle enough to be felt only as a difference at ankle height versus chest height. Within layered air, transmission changes again. Sound can refract slightly along gradients bending with temperature and density differences. Nothing dramatic is required. Even small gradients can alter how certain frequencies carry. The room becomes a medium with strata rather than a uniform field. A voice from another room reaches the ear in parts. Consonants dissolve first because they rely on rapid oscillations, high-frequency energy that disperses quickly. Vowels remain as broader bands. Meaning dissolves into tone. The air does not prevent sound from existing. It prevents sound from arriving intact. Light behaves differently in the same conditions. A denser medium, with more suspended moisture and particulate matter, scatters and diffuses. Illumination appears to spend itself sooner across distance. It is not that a lamp becomes weaker. It is that contrast thins. Surfaces still reflect, but reflection becomes more even, less crisp, less directional. Letters remain legible at close range, but the surrounding space feels filled, less clear, as though the air itself has acquired a faint surface. Breath enters, breath leaves. The medium enters and leaves with the same steadiness as before, yet it feels more present because it resists extension. Outside, geometry remains stable. Lampposts remain vertical. Signs remain fixed to walls. A figure at the end of the street remains visible as an outline, yet detail does not travel. Presence arrives without precision. Movement appears slower, not because velocity changes, but because transmission loses edge. What the eye receives is less sharply separated frame to frame. A bicycle passes. Near the source, the event is layered. Chain engagement, tire contact, small irregularities of pavement. With distance, components merge. Texture disappears first. Presence remains. The air compresses the radius of detail. The world becomes less broadcast, more contained, not by walls, but by medium. A street lamp at the end of the road illuminates the same radius it always has. The bulb draws the same current. The glass has not fogged. Yet the light appears to spend itself within a shorter distance tonight. Not because less light is emitted, but because more is scattered before it reaches distance. The cone of illumination looks fuller, softer, more self-contained. Light that would have continued is returned to the air close to the source. The lamp glows more inwardly. The street beyond it is darker, not because light was withheld, but because the medium kept more of it near. Indoors, the medium's effect is heard in how architecture fails to amplify. In lighter air, a scrape, a click, a small impact will find the room's surfaces and return faintly, adding thin reflections that extend the event. In denser still air, reflection is diminished. The event remains near its origin. A chair slides. The scrape forms a short line and ends. The sound does not draw itself outward. It settles. Corners hold stillness. Near the floor, cooler air accumulates, and the boundary between a hallway and a room becomes more than a visual threshold. Not because the door frame has changed, but because circulation narrows and slows. Where flow is restricted, density feels greater. A doorway behaves like a boundary in transmission. What passes through arrives less defined on the other side, as if the medium thickens at constriction. A book closes. At the source, contact is clean. Across space, the arrival is rounded. The beginning is softened, the end is sooner. No reflective tail follows. It is not silence that follows, but a return to a filled interval. Air that does not carry far. A window exists on one wall. Cold outside, warmer within. Along the glass, a thin layer of air holds a slightly different temperature than the air a hand's width away. That layer moves differently from the room's general air, slower, denser, hugging the surface. It does not mix readily. It persists as a boundary condition, a narrow region where two temperatures negotiate without resolving. The glass does not feel this. The air on both sides does not know the other exists, yet the boundary holds, maintained by the same physics that makes clouds form and fog settle and breath become visible on cold mornings. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the room remains occupied by the same medium, and the medium continues to reduce extension. The radius of detail contracts across modalities. Sound concludes sooner. Light loses crispness sooner. Even the sense of distance changes because distance is partly inferred from clarity. When clarity travels less, the brain receives less of what it normally uses to locate, separate, and expand space. The room retains measurement. The room loses reach. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. A car passes outside. The engine's layered frequencies merge into a single band more quickly than in daytime. The tires become less textured, more like a presence than a pattern. It is known that something passes, and then it is gone. The medium closes over it. A small splash in a gutter occurs. Water strikes water. The event registers and ends. No echo traces it. No ringing persists. The air keeps the event local. Temperature continues to fall toward equilibrium with surfaces. Relative humidity rises as the air approaches its dew point. Moisture begins to condense invisibly on stone, metal, and glass, changing reflectivity subtly. Dry surfaces that returned sharper reflections now return softer ones. Light becomes less directional. Edges soften not because objects blur, but because the medium and surface together reduce contrast. Sound behaves similarly. With increased density and reduced reflective return, the decay constant remains high. Vibrations lose amplitude quickly. The room becomes a container not because it is sealed, but because extension is no longer rewarded by the medium. Breath enters, breath leaves. The medium participates in the breath, and the breath participates in the medium without commentary. In this condition, silence is not emptiness. It is fullness without projection. Events do not stretch into distance. They arise and settle. The air does not erase. It contains. What the air contains tonight is not quite silence and not quite sound. It is the residue of the day's events, absorbed and held in the medium's increased mass. The footstep that ended sooner than usual. The voice that dissolved before it arrived complete. The bicycle that passed as presence rather than detail. None of these are stored as memory in the air. The air has no memory. Yet something of each event was given to the medium and did not pass through. It was kept briefly, as heat is kept in stone, not as record, but as condition. By morning, the air will thin again, cool again, carry again. What it held tonight will not be recovered. It will only be gone. As the night settles further, movement within the medium reduces to almost nothing. Convection that earlier produced subtle vertical exchange slows as temperature equalizes between surface and air. The layers that once differed in density begin to approach uniformity. The air no longer circulates in small currents along walls and across ceilings. It rests. Stillness does not mean emptiness. Molecules continue their motion, colliding, transferring energy in patterns too small to observe. Yet on the scale of the room there is no drift, no directional flow, no redistribution that alters transmission from moment to moment. The capacity to carry sound remains. The capacity to scatter light remains. The capacity to absorb high-frequency energy remains. What changes is variation. Variation reduces. The room has arrived at a condition that asks nothing of its contents. The table asks nothing of the chair. The chair asks nothing of the floor. The air asks nothing of the surfaces it rests against. Each thing has found the temperature it will hold until morning, the position it will occupy without shifting, the weight it will carry without complaint. This is not resignation. It is the room at its most itself, not performing stillness, simply having arrived at it through the long subtraction of the day. A sound could occur and would still propagate, yet it would conclude quickly, because the medium does not favor extension. Reflection remains minimal. Return remains weak. Events would remain local. Breath enters, breath leaves. The density of the air does not resist the breath. It does not announce itself. Yet its presence is felt a subtle resistance at the edge of inhalation. The lungs fill more deliberately, not because the body has changed, but because the medium has weight relative to motion. There is a particular quality to this weight that does not announce itself as heaviness. It is not the weight of pressure, not the weight of obstruction. It is the weight of a medium that has grown more present, more itself than it was at noon. Air that was a convenience has become a condition. The room has not changed. The air has remembered what it is. In denser, still air, even small temperature differences at the surface of skin dissipate more slowly. Heat transfer alters slightly. The boundary between body and room becomes less abrupt. The medium participates in exchange. No echo extends outward. No shimmer lingers at the edge of a sound. No bright edge of light projects far into the room. The interval remains filled. Distance continues to exist as measurement, but it no longer exists as expansion. Space feels complete rather than open, not smaller, complete. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. A faint mechanical click occurs somewhere in the structure of the building. It arrives softened and ends without resonance. Nothing returns from the walls. The medium accepts it and releases it into equilibrium. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. Objects remain where they are. Walls remain vertical. The ceiling remains above. Somewhere in the room, a surface holds a temperature slightly cooler than the air beside it. The air in contact with that surface has slowed its motion by a fraction. Not visible, not audible. A local condition, persisting because no force is present to disrupt it. That surface and that thin layer of air have arrived at a quiet agreement, neither moving, neither changing, neither requiring the other to be anything other than what it is at this hour, in this stillness, in this medium that has finally grown heavy enough to rest. Transmission rests within containment. No extension seeks amplification. No surface offers echo. No event exceeds its origin. The medium does not withdraw, it does not thin, it simply remains. There is a particular quality to a room when the air has grown heavy enough to keep things close. Not oppressive, not sealed. More like a room that has decided quietly to hold what it contains rather than pass it outward. Sound stays near its source. Light stays near its lamp. Warmth stays near the body. Each thing remains in relation only to what is immediately beside it. The room becomes a collection of small proximities rather than a single connected field. And in that collection, something releases. The effort of being aware of distance, of tracking what is far, of maintaining the sense of where one thing ends and another begins across the room. The medium has done that work without being asked. It has closed the distances by making them less traversable. The room is not smaller. The room is simply closer to itself. The interval stays occupied. Nothing disperses. Nothing insists. The room holds. When night falls and sound withdraws, the archive remains. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. A disk of metal rests in a room that does not move. Its edge is thin. Its circle is complete. Weight gathers toward the center and distributes again toward the rim with no visible preference. The metal has no expression by itself. It does not brighten on its own. It does not darken on its own. It remains what it is and only becomes mirror when light arrives in a way that can be returned. Light arrives, light leaves. Between those two motions, a surface can behave in more than one way without changing what it is made of. One face has been prepared, not with ornament, with reduction, with the removal of small irregularities until the surface becomes an agreement, a plane so consistent that direction can be preserved. The hand that touches it feels smoothness, but the smoothness that matters is smaller than touch. It is the kind of smoothness that allows rays arriving together to leave together, keeping their order. What was removed to make this surface was not foreign material. It was the surface itself, the original texture of the metal, the small hills and valleys that formed when the metal cooled, the microgeography of its first existence. Preparation is subtraction. The mirror is what remains after the metal's own surface has been taken away, layer by layer, until what is left is no longer the metal's native form, but a form imposed by intention. A candle flame appears elsewhere in the room. The flame is not on the metal, it is only near it, yet the flame becomes visible inside the disc, suspended behind the surface, at a distance that matches the distance before it. The disc does not contain depth. Depth is assembled by the leaving light. A face approaches, and a face is returned. A wall stands behind, and the wall is returned. A room surrounds, and the room is returned. Nothing enters the metal. Nothing stays. The return is not a stored image. It is direction preserved. It is light leaving in a coherent arrangement that makes the mind call it room, face, distance. The disc remains unchanged. The relation changes, and the return changes with it, or in the same medium that shapes the room's reach. A spoon touches ceramic. At the point of contact, the vibration is precise. Across the room, the arrival contains less definition. The body of the sound remains, but the outline has blurred. Something has been absorbed in transit. The object did not soften. The hand did not change. Only the interval intervened, taking away part of what would normally survive. Between the spoon and the ear, nothing visible occupies the distance. And yet the distance is occupied. What the air removes in transit, it removes without remainder. Not stored, not redirected, simply no longer present in what arrives. Loss without trace, absence without record. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between the two, the air holds still. The candle flame reflected in the prepared face is not the same candle flame that burns in the room. It is a version made of leaving light. The light that departed the flame crossed the air, met the surface, and returned. The reflected flame is always younger than the flame itself by the time it takes light to complete that crossing, which is no time at all. And yet the distinction holds. What the mirror shows is not the flame, but what the flame sent. The original burns. The return is already the past, arriving continuously, too fast to notice the difference. A small shift in angle changes everything. The surface does not choose what to show. It obeys alignment. When the disk tilts, the return room tilts. When the observer moves, the returned observer moves. Symmetry is not a message. It is a rule expressed by angle. A faint scratch interrupts the return, not as symbol, as interruption. In the narrow line of abrasion, direction is no longer preserved with the same care. The returned room breaks there. A face divides slightly. The world remains outside the disk, but the coherence of the leaving light has been altered by a microscopic ridge. The scratch did not arrive all at once. It was made in a single motion, but the damage it caused is a gradient. Deeper at the point of first contact, shallower where the abrasive force diminished toward the end of the stroke. Along its length, the disruption changes in degree. At the deepest point, reflection is most disturbed. At the shallower ends, the return is only slightly altered, a faint tremor in the room that appears behind the surface. The scratch is not uniform. Damage rarely is. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. The disk remains circular. The disk remains heavy. Preparation does not change mass, yet preparation divides behavior. Turn the disk. The reverse face has not been made to answer. It has not been reduced into alignment. It holds its ordinary irregularity, the minute texture of metal that has not been corrected into a single plane. Under light, it is not dark. It is not dull. It is simply not organized. Light arrives. Light leaves, but it leaves without order. Brightness spreads across the reverse face and disperses. No room assembles behind it. No face appears at equal distance. No stable geometry returns. The surface receives light and releases it as many small departures, each direction slightly different. Each tiny plane of texture sending light away on its own path. A face placed before this side does not become a duplicate. The outline does not stabilize. The features do not hold. The metal does not refuse the face. It simply does not perform the relation that creates doubling. The same disk, the same thickness, the same weight. One face returns the world as if the world were arranged. The other face returns light as if arrangement were unnecessary. The difference is not story. The difference is preparation. A surface can be instructed without inscription. A surface can be disciplined without words. Polish is a kind of instruction. Make the departures coherent. Allow a single direction to dominate. The reverse face has no such instruction. It has no obligation. Yet the reverse face is not without its own precision. Under close examination, its texture has structure. Not the imposed structure of preparation, but the native structure of the metal's own formation. The irregularities are not random. They follow the grain of the material, the direction in which it was worked, the orientation of its crystalline structure. The reverse face is patterned. It is simply patterned differently, at a scale and in a direction that does not produce coherent return. What looks like disorder from a distance is, from very close, a different kind of order. Breath enters, breath leaves. The space between surface and observer is unchanged. Only the leaving light changes. Stand before the prepared face and the room extends. The wall behind appears to continue beyond the disc. Depth opens where there is only metal. The disc becomes a threshold. It turns a contained room into a doubled room without moving any wall. Turn the disc and the threshold closes, not by door, by the absence of coherent return. The room remains the same size, but it no longer appears to extend. The disc becomes an object again, metal present, depth absent. The unreflected surface keeps light near. It does not project the room outward into a second space. It disperses. It returns brightness without constructing distance. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. A mirror is often known by what it gives back. Yet the reverse face shows that mirror is not essence. It is condition. It is the moment when a surface becomes capable of a particular relationship, preserving direction rather than breaking it. Both faces are stable. Both faces are quiet. One performs symmetry. One performs dispersion. The room does not know which face is turned toward it. The room offers itself equally in either direction. Its walls, its light, its objects, all available to be received or not received, returned or not returned. The room has no preference. It continues to be the room regardless of what the disc does with what the room sends. Only the observer, standing before one face or the other, experiences the difference. The disc and the room are indifferent to each other. It is only the relation, the standing before, the looking, that makes one face a threshold and the other a surface. Yata no Kagami. A name remains even when the room is unlit. The name does not require reflection. The disc does not require a returned face in order to persist as metal. The story that surrounds the name can remain outside the room, outside the surface. What matters here is not myth spoken aloud. What matters is that the disc demonstrates a split that is not a split of substance. Preparation imposes expectation. Expectation is not visible. It becomes visible only when light arrives. On the prepared face, light leaves as a range return. The world seems to answer itself. A face looks and receives a face. A room looks and receives a room. Distance behaves with symmetry. On the reverse face, light leaves without arrangement. The world meets the surface and does not come back as image. It comes back as scattered brightness, a soft field with no geometry to inhabit. A small change in illumination changes the balance. In full light, the prepared face holds its clarity easily. Edges are sharp. The returned wall is stable. The returned face is precise. The reverse face remains what it is. Brightness without assembly. A surface that refuses to become a second room. As light lowers, the prepared face still answers, but begins to thin. Contrast reduces before shape disappears. The returned room remains visible first as structure, then as outline, then as a vague arrangement of tones that no longer promises precision. This thinning is not failure, it is dependency. The prepared face depends on sufficient light to carry the return. The geometry of reflection remains intact at all times, but the geometry needs content. Without enough photons, the return cannot build itself into certainty. The surface does not change, the source does. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between the two, light reduces another degree. At dusk, the prepared face offers a faint room. A lamp becomes a soft point behind the surface. A face becomes an outline without detail. The reverse face offers the same soft brightness it offered earlier, unchanged by the loss of clarity because it never promised clarity. As the room darkens further, the distinction between faces begins to narrow, not because the reverse becomes reflective, but because the prepared face becomes less able to demonstrate its preparation. Under low light, even a perfect surface cannot return what is not available. A mirror seems defined by response, yet response is conditional. A surface can be prepared and still appear blank if the source is absent. The disk persists regardless. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. Turn the disk in low light, and the difference becomes subtle. The prepared face still holds a trace of alignment, a slightly more coherent glimmer. The reverse holds a softer diffusion. The difference is now a difference in how the small remaining light is handled, gathered into a more directional return, or broken into many directions at once. The world grows quiet in its own way, not by instruction, by reduction. The prepared face no longer doubles the room. It hints at doubling without producing it. The reverse face continues to be itself. It receives without projecting. The disk holds two modes: return or do not return. Neither mode is moral, neither mode is chosen. Both are stable behaviors of a surface under light. The name remains. The disk remains. Preparation remains even when it cannot be read. Night enters gradually, not as curtain, but as reduction. Illumination decreases in measurable increments. The prepared face continues to preserve direction, yet fewer rays arrive to be preserved. The geometry remains exact, though there is less to carry along it. Specular alignment requires only smoothness and angle. It does not require abundance. Even under low light, a coherent surface can still return direction. Yet coherence without sufficient contrast cannot assemble into recognizable form. The prepared face now returns faint gradients rather than clear objects. A wall becomes a tonal shift. A face becomes a shadow of a shadow. The reverse face continues its dispersion. Under stronger light, it scatters detail. Under weaker light, it scatters less because there is less to scatter. The difference between faces narrows, not because the reverse has gained coherence, but because the prepared face has lost visibility of its discipline. Both surfaces approach the same perceptual state. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, photons decrease. As illumination falls further, the prepared face ceases to produce an image that can be distinguished from surrounding dark. The law of reflection persists. Angle still equals angle, yet without incoming rays sufficient to register at the eye, the equality produces no event. The reverse face, under these conditions, is not more or less active. It continues to send light outward in multiple directions, but the light is too scarce to form brightness beyond immediate proximity. At this level of reduction, both surfaces appear equally unresponsive. The disk does not change temperature in any dramatic way. It cools gradually along with the room. Metal contracts microscopically as temperature drops. The contraction is uniform across the disk, not favoring one face over the other. Preparation remains. Texture remains. The difference in microtopography remains measurable even when it is no longer perceptible. The disk that is cooling tonight has been cooling every night since it was made. Each cooling contracts the metal by the same small amount. Each warming expands it. The prepared surface has moved through thousands of these cycles without losing its preparation. Expansion and contraction are uniform enough that the microtopography does not change. The surface retains the instruction given to it through every night, through every season, through every change of the room around it, without requiring the room to be any particular way. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. In near darkness, reflection is no longer an observable phenomenon. The surface that once doubled space now participates in the same darkness as every other object. The distinction between threshold and object dissolves. The disk ceases to behave as extension and returns to behaving as mass. Angle becomes irrelevant without visible return. Source becomes irrelevant without emission sufficient to register. Surface becomes irrelevant without relation. What remains is material. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the disk does not promise response. No room appears behind it. No face stabilizes within it. No depth suggests continuation. The prepared face holds its smoothness without demonstration. The reverse holds its texture without shame. Both remain metal. The condition under which return becomes possible has withdrawn. In darkness, all mirrors resemble their reverse, not because they have changed, but because return has ceased to differentiate them. There is something in this equivalence that the day does not offer. In full light, the two faces are distinct. One a window onto a second room, one a plain surface. In darkness, that distinction dissolves, and what remains is simply the disk, present as mass, present as metal, present as the object it always was beneath the behavior it performed. The mirror and its reverse were always the same thing. Darkness restores that sameness, not as loss. As return to what was there before preparation made a difference, the disk rests. No obligation to answer. When night falls and sound withdraws, the archive remains. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. There is a surface. It does not announce itself. It exists at the boundary between one density and another, between what moves freely and what does not move at all. For a moment, it held something above it. Now it holds the record of what was above. The water does not grieve this. It has no mechanism for grief. It has surface tension, molecular cohesion, the slow redistribution of thermal energy as the light source withdraws below the geometry of the earth. These are not emotions. They are arrangements. They are the way one state of matter negotiates the presence of another. The surface is there. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. It feels smoothness, but the smoothness that matters is smaller than touch. It is the kind of smoothness that allows rays arriving together to leave together, keeping their order. What was removed to make this surface was not foreign material. It was the surface itself, the original texture of the metal, the small hills and valleys that formed when the metal cooled, the microgeography of its first existence. Preparation is subtraction. The mirror is what remains after the metal's own surface has been taken away layer by layer, until what is left is no longer the metal's native form, but a form imposed by intention. A candle flame appears elsewhere in the room. The flame is not on the metal. It is only near it, yet the flame becomes visible inside the disc, suspended behind the surface, at a distance that matches the distance before it. The disc does not contain depth. Depth is assembled by the leaving light. A face approaches, and a face is returned. A wall stands behind, and the wall is returned. A room surrounds, and the room is returned. Nothing enters the metal. Nothing stays. The return is not a stored image. It is direction preserved. It is light leaving in a coherent arrangement that makes the mind call it room, face, distance. The disc remains unchanged. The relation changes, and the return changes with it, or in the same medium that shapes the room's reach. A spoon touches ceramic. At the point of contact, the vibration is precise. Across the room, the arrival contains less definition. The body of the sound remains, but the outline has blurred. Something has been absorbed in transit. The object did not soften. The hand did not change. Only the interval intervened, taking away part of what would normally survive. Between the spoon and the ear, nothing visible occupies the distance, and yet the distance is occupied. What the air removes in transit, it removes without remainder. Earlier, the surface held the full spectrum. The shorter wavelengths scattered first, deflected by the atmosphere's depth at low angles, distributed across the visible field in frequencies the eye registers as blue, as pale, as the colorlessness of altitude. The longer wavelengths traveled further. They arrived at the surface still intact. Orange, red, the color of iron at the threshold of its transformation. The water accepted these without preference. A surface accepts without selecting. It takes the angle of incidence and returns the angle of reflection with mathematical fidelity, adjusting only for the refractive index of the medium below. The surface is not generous, it is not indifferent. It is a boundary condition. A boundary condition performs its function without deliberation. Now the light source has moved below the horizon. The surface still holds something, not the colors themselves. The cooling the colors left behind. Thermal memory. The water that absorbed the red frequencies is fractionally warmer than the water that absorbed nothing. This difference is measured in thousandths of a degree. It is real. It is invisible. It will dissipate before morning. What remains is not warmth. What remains is the record of warmth, written in a medium that cannot hold it. Above withdraws. This is not a metaphor. The sky above the water is a physical object, a column of gas layered by density, held to the surface of the earth by gravitational attraction. As the light source drops below the geometric horizon, the column loses its borrowed luminosity from the bottom upward. The lowest layer darkens first, then the next, then the next. The surface registers this, not because it thinks, not because it perceives, because reflection is a physical process, and physical processes respond to changed conditions. Where the sky was bright, the surface returned brightness. Where the sky darkens, the surface returns darkness. Not immediately, not all at once. In the gradual way that any large body of water integrates a changing input. The pond is slow, the pond is thorough. By the time the sky at the horizon has passed from orange to the color that exists between orange and absence, the surface has already begun to hold the color of the zenith instead. That deeper blue the atmosphere retains longest. That last frequency before the atmosphere admits the light is truly gone. The pond is always slightly behind the sky. The pond is always catching up to something that has already moved. This delay is not a flaw. It is the nature of large systems. They are not quick. They are complete. There is a film. At the boundary between water and air, molecules are pulled in three directions simultaneously. Downward by the bulk of the liquid beneath them, sideways by neighboring molecules in the same plane, upward. But upward there is only air, only scattered molecules of nitrogen and oxygen that make no comparable claim. The surface molecules pull harder sideways. They pull harder down. The result is a film that behaves as though it were elastic, as though it had been stretched across the opening of something. It has not been stretched. It simply is. The tension is a consequence of asymmetry, of being at a boundary, of having more below than above. Every molecule at the surface experiences this. Every molecule holds the plane intact by being held in turn. A fly lands. Its weight distributes across a contact area small enough that the surface tension is not overcome. The fly stands on a film that is not solid, in a region that is not quite liquid, at a boundary that has no thickness. The fly does not understand this. The surface does not offer explanation. When the fly leaves, the surface closes behind it. No record, no mark. The film was disturbed and the film recovered. These are not opposites. They are the same process at different moments. Disturbance and recovery share a single mechanism. Only timing separates them. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. The sky has left the color in the water. It is not the sky's current color. The sky's color is changing, has changed, is still changing in the upper atmosphere. What the water holds is the sky's previous color, the one from moments ago, the one that no longer exists above. The water is slower than the sky. The water holds what the sky has already abandoned. This is not loss, or it is loss, but loss functioning as record. The water does not know what it holds, it only holds. The surface receives the angle and returns it. The bulk absorbs the frequencies and warms by fractions. The sky and the water negotiate this every evening. Neither initiates, neither concludes. The light withdraws, the surface adjusts, the record dissolves, the sky moves forward, the water holds the sky's past. At every moment, the water is the sky's memory of itself, a memory the sky does not possess, held by a medium the sky does not control. What is left is not the sky's color. What is left is not the water's color. What is left is the boundary state between one system losing something and another system returning it. Below the surface, the column of water is not uniform. Sunlight penetrates to depth, but selectively, frequency by frequency, each wavelength absorbed at its own rate. Red is absorbed shallowest, within the first few meters. Orange follows. Yellow continues longer. Green reaches deeper. Blue deepest of all, traveling further into the column, before the last photons convert to heat too small to measure from outside. The water below the surface has been stratified by light, not by the light that is there now, by the light of the hours before. The upper layers hold the warmth of the afternoon. The deeper layers are untouched by today's sun, responding instead to the thermal history of the season, of the months, of accumulated input that sank through convection and settled where settling happens. A diver passing through this column would feel the layers, would feel where this day ends and last week begins, would feel further down the temperature of winter, the temperature of the last hard frost that crossed the air above. The water holds all of this without distinction. Today's warmth and last winter's cold, layered, not confused, simply present simultaneously, each at its own depth, each real. From the surface, none of this is visible. The surface shows only what is above it. Below, in the column, the full archive extends downward into temperatures no current day has touched. The surface and the archive are contiguous. They share no information. The surface reflects what arrives from above. The column retains what sank from the same surface months ago, under different light, in a different season. They are the same body of water. They do not communicate. Two records, one medium, neither aware of the other. There is a moment in the transition from dusk to dark when the surface of the water and the sky above it reach the same luminosity. The sky is still faintly lit. The water still holds the sky's reflection, but the two are close enough in brightness that the boundary between them becomes uncertain. Not invisible, uncertain. A bird above the pond looking down would see the sky. A fish below looking up would see the sky. The surface for this moment does not separate these. It holds both simultaneously, neither above nor below asserting priority. This is the same surface that an hour ago doubled the room. that returned a second sky above the first, that made depth where there was only water. That doubling required difference. It required sky brighter than surface, or surface brighter than depth. Contrast made the threshold visible. Contrast made the return legible. Now contrast has withdrawn with the light. The surface still performs reflection. The geometry of angle is intact, but there is no longer sufficient difference between what arrives and what surrounds the arrival for the return to be readable as return. The surface is reflecting. The reflection is invisible. Both are true simultaneously. Neither cancels the other. This moment does not last. The sky will continue to darken. The surface will follow. The threshold will re-establish itself, visible again as water retains faint light longer than the air above it. Then as both reach the same dark, and the difference becomes structural rather than luminous. You know the surface is there because water does not move the way air moves, because wind makes different shapes at a boundary than it makes in open space. But in that moment, the moment of equivalence, the surface is neither mirror nor membrane. It is the place where above and below have made the same concession simultaneously. That moment has passed before it can be named. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. Where the water meets the edge, the stone at the bank, the root that enters the water at an angle, the reed stem that passes through the surface from below. Something happens to the plane. The surface does not remain flat. It curves. At the contact point between water and solid material, surface tension adjusts to the adhesive forces between water molecules and the material's surface. If the material is hydrophilic, if it has an affinity for water, as stone does, as most natural materials do, the water climbs slightly up the surface. The edge of the water is higher than the middle. The surface curves upward at its boundaries. This curve is the meniscus. It is small. It is measurable. It is the consequence of competing attractions, water for water, water for stone, resolved at the boundary into a shape that satisfies both claims simultaneously. The meniscus is not a compromise. It is the precise geometry physics requires when two different kinds of attraction meet at a shared edge. In the dark, the meniscus at the reed stem, and the meniscus at the stone bank, and the meniscus at every submerged root are performing their function without observation. The curve holds. The water is slightly higher at every edge than at the open center. The geometry of attraction persists through the night without requiring light to maintain it. The boundary of the pond is not a line. It is a curve. It has always been a curve. What looks like an edge from above is, from the side, an arc. The surface is still there. In the dark, it does not cease. Surface tension continues. The boundary between water and air continues. The molecules at the plane of contact continue their asymmetric arrangement, pulling toward the bulk, holding the film intact. No light arrives. The surface has nothing to reflect. It reflects the night sky, but the night sky at this hour is deep enough that the reflection is indistinguishable from the water's own darkness, from the depth below, from the column of cold that extends to the bed of the pond. and holds the records of seasons the surface has never witnessed. A wind crosses. The surface reorganizes. The reorganization propagates outward in rings the dark makes invisible. The rings cross each other, combine, cancel, combine again. The interference patterns are real. They are happening. No eye records them. When the wind stops, the surface settles. It does not return to the exact configuration it held before the wind. The molecules are not the same molecules. The thermal distribution has shifted by fractions. The surface is the same surface, same boundary, same tension, same negotiation between bulk and air. And it is not the same surface. Both are true. Neither cancels the other. The wind did not alter what the surface is. The wind altered only the momentary arrangement of what the surface holds. These are not the same thing. A second wind crosses, smaller. It moves along the bank where the meniscus meets stone, where water has been slightly elevated by adhesion since before the light failed. The meniscus does not yield to the wind. Surface tension at the edge holds the curve intact against the small lateral pressure. The curve was made by molecular attraction, and molecular attraction does not negotiate with wind. When this wind also stops, the surface settles again. Different configuration, same surface, same curve at every edge. This is what the surface holds, now that above has withdrawn. The thermal impression of the afternoon cooling. The faint stratification of a day's light settling. The interference pattern of the last wind dissipating. The depth below, which holds older records still. None of this is visible. The surface holds what it holds. The column holds what the column holds. The temperature differential between today's warmth and last winter's cold persists at its proper depth, not as memory. Water has no memory, but as physical fact, as the arrangement of matter that results from everything that has happened to it. What happened to it became it. The sky above withdrew. The surface accepted the withdrawal. The record of what was above is held now in the cooling, in the depth, in the thermal stratification of a column that no longer receives input. Input has stopped. Record continues. This is what it means for a surface to close. Not to seal, not to end, but to shift from receiving to holding. The surface does not close in the sense of a door. It closes in the sense of a transition between states. The moment when accumulation becomes archive, when the day stops writing and what was written remains. The surface that reflected noon reflected it accurately. The surface that reflected dusk reflected it accurately. The surface that now reflects darkness reflects it with the same fidelity. Nothing has changed in the surface's behavior. What has changed is only what behavior now means. Accuracy in darkness produces no image. Fidelity to absence is still fidelity. Above has withdrawn. The surface is still. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. There is a surface. It has been there since before this began. It will be there after. The thermal record of today is cooling through the layers below. The sky above has reached its deepest frequency. The meniscus holds its curve at every edge, against stone, against root, against every solid thing the water touches. Small, exact, unobserved. The surface is not resting. Rest implies a previous activity from which something withdrew. The surface is continuing. Surface tension continues. The molecules at the boundary continue their asymmetric negotiation. More pull below, less pull above. The film held intact by the aggregate of 1 billion small asymmetries, all pointing in the same direction. This is what the surface does at night, what it has done through every night before this one. From above, stillness. Within the column, slow motion, perpetual, invisible. At every edge, the curve that has no name in the dark. The cold of last winter is still there, at its proper depth, exactly as cold as the record requires. The surface that held the afternoon sky holds now only the absence of sky. Both are accurate returns. Both are the same surface. Preparation does not change what the surface is made of. The evening does not change what the surface is made of. What changes is only what arrives to be returned. And now, what arrives is dark, and the surface returns dark, faithfully, without preference, without loss. No retrieval necessary, no return expected. The surface continues. When night falls, the archive remains. When night falls and sound withdraws, the archive remains. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. There is air between the shelves, not emptiness. Air. A column of gas with measurable density, measurable temperature, measurable composition, held in place by the shelves on either side and the floor below and the ceiling above, contained without being enclosed, present without being noticed. The shelf does not know it is holding anything. The air does not know it is being held. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. The interval was not designed. When the shelves were built and placed, the gap between them was a consequence of dimension, of the width of the shelf unit, the width of the room, the number of shelves required, the space remaining after placement. The interval is what was left over. It is the remainder of a calculation performed for other purposes. And yet, the interval is where everything happens. The books face outward from both sides. Their spines hold titles, authors, numbers assigned by systems of organization that attempted to impose order on the accumulation of recorded thought. The spines face the interval. They present themselves to the air between the shelves, to anyone moving through that air, to the light that enters from one end and diminishes toward the other. What the books face is not the reader. What the books face is the interval itself. The reader is only passing through. Paper ages in air. This is not metaphor. Cellulose, the structural material of paper, undergoes hydrolysis and oxidation over time, reactions accelerated by the presence of moisture, acid, and light, and slowed by cool, dry darkness. The paper in these shelves is aging at the rate the air permits. The air between the shelves is the medium of the paper's transformation. Every page in every book is in slow negotiation with the air that surrounds it. The older volumes release something into that air. Lignin, present in papers made before the acid-free era, breaks down into organic compounds, vanillin among them, the same aldehyde that gives vanilla its character. This is not romance, it is chemistry. The smell of old books is the smell of paper decomposing at a rate too slow to observe directly, releasing its structure molecule by molecule into the air that holds it. The air between the shelves carries this. A person entering the interval breathes it, receives into their body the molecular record of the paper's age, of the decades in which these volumes stood in this air, of the slow transaction between cellulose and atmosphere that has been proceeding since the books were placed here. The reader inhales the library's time. The library does not notice. Sound enters the interval and does not return the same. In open space, sound propagates outward in all directions, a sphere of compression and rarefaction, expanding at the speed of sound in air, diminishing in intensity as the sphere grows. In the interval between shelves, this changes. The shelves interrupt the expansion. Sound that would have traveled sideways meets paper and board, and the compressed fiber of bound volumes, and some fraction is absorbed, converted to heat too small to measure, and the rest reflected back into the interval. The interval is a space of partial return. Sound enters, some leaves, some stays, reflected between the parallel faces of the shelves, bouncing at angles that grow smaller with each reflection, losing energy incrementally until what remains is below the threshold of hearing. The interval does not silence sound. It shortens it. It removes its tail and returns only the immediate and direct. A whisper in the interval carries less far than a whisper in open air. It is not quieter. It is shorter. This is a different kind of silence, not the absence of sound, the absence of the sound's continuation. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. The air in the interval is not uniform. Temperature stratifies. Warm air lighter rises. Cool air heavier settles. The lower shelves hold cooler air near the floor. The upper shelves hold air that is fractionally warmer. Air that has risen from the breathing of visitors and the operation of lights and the slow release of heat from the building structure. Between floor and ceiling, the interval contains a gradient, not steep, not dramatic, but real and continuous, a slow transition from cool to warm that follows no human intention. The books on the lower shelves age in cooler air. Their chemistry is slower there. The books on the upper shelves age faster, in air that is warmer by a degree or two, in conditions that accelerate the hydrolysis of their cellulose by a fraction that compounds over decades into a visible difference: yellower pages, more brittle spines, a greater quantity of vanillin released into the air above. The upper interval smells older than the lower interval. The difference is small. It is real. A hand reaching for a book on a high shelf passes through air that carries more history than the air at knee level. The reader does not know this. The reader selects by title, by author, by the number on the spine. The air through which the hand passes carries no label. Dust settles in the interval. Particles enter from outside, through ventilation, through the movement of visitors, through the opening and closing of doors that disturb the air and introduce what the air outside contains. Once inside the interval, the particles slow. The shelves on either side reduce the lateral movement of air. The stillness of the interval allows particles to settle at rates determined by their size and density and the viscosity of the air. Heavy particles settle first. Fine particles remain suspended longer, days sometimes, held in the air of the interval by thermal convection, too gentle to feel, but sufficient to counteract the slow pull of gravity on particles of that mass. The interval holds its dust in suspension. When light enters from one end, a window at the corridor's terminus, the beam of a lamp carried by a visitor, the suspended particles become visible. The interval reveals itself as not empty, but inhabited. The air between the shelves suddenly shown to be a column of slow movement, of particles tracing the invisible currents of temperature and ventilation that organize the air of the interval at all times, seen or unseen. The light does not create the movement. The light reveals what was already moving. When the light withdraws, the movement continues, unseen, unheld, real. The books have been here longer than the air. Air turns over. The interval exchanges its air with the larger room with the building with the outside. The residence time of any given molecule of air in the interval is hours, perhaps days, in still conditions. The air that is here now was not here last week. It will not be here next week. The books have been here for decades. They have been breathed through, in the sense that the air carrying their molecular exhalations has passed through lungs and returned. More carbon dioxide, more moisture, more warmth. The books have participated in the respiration of everyone who has stood in this interval. None of those exchanges were preserved. The books held their positions while the air moved through them and the people moved through the air, and none of it accumulated into anything that can now be retrieved. The interval holds no memory. The interval holds only the present arrangement of air. And yet the present arrangement carries the past. In the temperature gradient built up over the day's pattern of use, in the suspended particles introduced by the morning's first visitors, in the molecular compounds released by papers aging since before anyone now living first entered this building. The interval does not remember. The interval is the result of everything that has happened in it. These are not the same thing. Both are true. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. At night, the interval changes. Not in structure. The shelves remain. The books remain. The gap between them remains the same width it was at noon, at dusk, at closing. The interval does not contract in the dark. It does not expand. It holds its dimension with the indifference of physical space, which has no preference for occupation. What changes is the air. Without visitors, the air stills. The convective currents generated by moving bodies, by the warmth of hands reaching across the interval, by the breath of readers exhaling into the gap. These cease. The gradient between floor and ceiling settles toward its natural state, undisturbed by human introduction of heat. The suspended particles, no longer agitated by movement, begin their slow descent. The interval is settling, not sleeping, settling, reaching toward the configuration it would hold if left alone long enough. A temperature gradient determined only by the building's thermal mass. A particle distribution determined only by gravity and the slow convection of air against surfaces of different temperatures. A chemical composition determined only by what the books release and what the ventilation provides. This is the interval without use. It is not empty. It is what the interval is when nothing is asked of it. Consider what the interval requires in order to function. 2 shelves, a gap, air. The shelves provide the boundary. The gap provides the space. The air provides the medium through which the interval's purpose, the presentation of books to those who move through, becomes possible. Remove the air and the interval becomes a vacuum. The spines of the books facing each other across a space that carries nothing, transmits nothing, allows no approach. The air is not incidental. The air is the interval's capacity. What makes the interval a place where something can happen is not the shelves. The shelves are only walls. What makes it a place is the air between them. The medium that carries light from the ceiling to the spine, that carries the reader's vision from eye to title, that carries the sound of a finger running along spines in search of a specific volume, that carries the molecular record of the book's slow transformation from the paper outward into the space where a reader stands. The interval functions because it is filled. It is filled with what cannot be seen. The last visitor left hours ago. The door closed. The lights reduced to their overnight state, not extinguished, but lowered to a level that maintains the building without serving reading. The interval received this change as it receives all changes, by continuing. The air continued. The temperature gradient continued its slow approach to equilibrium. The particles continued their descent. The books stand in the interval. Their spines face each other across the air. The titles on those spines name things, events, ideas, people, phenomena that exist or existed outside this room, outside this building, outside this interval. The names on the spines are the interval's record of what the world outside contains. The interval holds these names in the dark, arranged by systems of organization that do not require light to remain valid. The classification persists. The order persists. The air between the named things persists. What the interval holds at night is the same as what it held at noon. The names, the gaps between names, the air inside the gaps. At noon, these were available. At night, these continue. Availability is not the same as existence. The interval exists whether or not it is available to be used. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. There is a particular stillness that belongs to the interval between shelves at night. It is not the stillness of a room. A room is too large. Its air moves in currents shaped by the room's geometry, by the placement of vents and windows, by the thermal mass of its walls. The interval is narrower. Its air is more constrained. The shelves on either side limit the lateral movement of air to what can pass through the books themselves, through the gaps between volumes, through the porous structure of the paper, through the small spaces where spines do not quite meet. Air passes through books, slowly, in negligible quantities, but the flow is real. The pressure differential between one side of the shelf and the other, a differential created by the building's ventilation, by the thermal gradient between interior and exterior, by the movement of air in the larger space beyond the shelves, drives a slow percolation through the stacked volumes. Air moves through paper. Paper accepts this without change to its structure, without record of the passage. The books are permeable. The interval breathes through them. This is not visible. It is not audible. It is a flow too slow and too distributed to register as movement. And yet it connects the interval to what is beyond the shelves, to the larger room, to the building, to the outside air, through the medium of the books themselves. The interval is not sealed. The interval is in slow conversation with everything beyond it, conducted through paper, at a rate that no instrument in this room is positioned to measure. The air holds the interval open. This is the reversal that the shelves conceal. It appears that the shelves create the interval, that the wooden uprights and the boards between them are the structure that makes the gap possible. But structure without medium is only geometry. The shelves define the boundary of the interval. The air gives the interval its character, its temperature, its acoustics, its chemical composition, its capacity to carry light and sound, and the molecular record of the book's slow transformation. The shelves are necessary. The air is what the interval is. Take the books away and the interval remains. Air between empty shelves, the same dimension, the same temperature gradient, the same acoustic properties. Take the air away and the interval becomes a description of a space, a set of coordinates, a geometry with no substance. The air is not inside the interval. The air is the interval. It is late. The building has reached the temperature it reaches at this hour, in this season, with the heating system set to its overnight level. The interval has reached the temperature the interval reaches when visitors have been absent for this many hours, when the air has had this long to settle, when the thermal contributions of human presence have dissipated into the building's larger thermal mass. The particles that were suspended at closing have descended by now to the lower shelves, to the floor, to the horizontal surfaces of books shelved flat. The air in the interval is cleaner than it was. Not pure. Purity is not available in a space that breathes through paper and communicates slowly with the outside. But cleaner, more settled. The interval is as still as it gets. This stillness is not silence. The building makes sounds, the contraction of materials cooling, the operation of the ventilation system, the distant traffic that enters through walls and glass as a frequency too low to identify as anything specific. The interval receives these sounds and shortens them in the way the interval shortens all sounds. What arrives in the interval loses its tail. What remains is only the immediate. The interval keeps nothing it receives. It holds its air. It holds its dimension. It holds the books along its edges, facing inward, their titles present in the dark to no one, the held interval. Not held by the shelves only mark its edges, held by the air that fills it, by the surface tension of stillness that forms in narrow spaces when movement ceases, by the slow equalization of temperature and particle distribution that draws the interval toward the particular configuration that is its own, that belongs to no other space. That is the result of these shelves, this air, this night, this accumulation of days in which these books stood in this gap and released their molecules into this specific column of atmosphere. The interval is held by what it holds. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. There is air between the shelves. It has been there since the shelves were placed. it will be there after. It carries what the building provides, and what the books release, and what the day's visitors left behind in the form of warmth and particles, and the molecular traces of breath. It carries all of this without preference, without selection, without the capacity to distinguish between what matters and what does not. The air does not know what it holds. The names on the spines face into it. The temperature gradient rises through it. The particles suspended in it continue their slow descent. The molecular record of decades of slow paper oxidation drift through it, carried on currents too gentle to feel. The interval holds this, not as archive. The air keeps no record. As condition, as the present state of a space that has been accumulating its present state for as long as these shelves have stood here. Between the shelves, air. Between the words, silence. Between breaths, the interval that makes the next breath possible. No retrieval necessary. The interval continues. When night falls, the archive remains.